Hi, I'm Annalise Trudell, the Manager of Education, Training and Research at Inova, and I'm here to talk about domestic violence and domestic homicide risk assessment. Now we're going to cover the topic on quite a high level with some general sort of best practices, some general knowledge around risk factors, but I think it's really important to recognize that any given circumstance is unique, and we are here to support you in navigating that given circumstance through our crisis and support line. That number is 519-642-3000. So please reach out when you have an individual circumstance that you're wanting to sort of apply some of what we talk about today. We're going to start with an understanding of what are some of the risk factors, what does the literature tell us around primary, secondary risk factors. We'll then move to how to prompt gaining that information around risk factors. So what are some guiding questions that can get us that information? And then finally, what are some do's and don'ts around managing a disclosure of violence? Some best practices around supporting someone who discloses to you. Let's begin with risk factors. So what is risk? Risk is the presence of potential danger. So when we're trying to assess whether risk is present or possible, we're really talking about a highly fluid, highly contextual and dynamic assessment. And so while we might assess that at this given moment, 5 hours later, that risk assessment may have changed. So we have to understand that while we're presenting some guidelines, you really need to be working with the situation, and there is no perfect way of going about this. There are two kinds of risks that we're going to talk about. One is primary risk, and the second are secondary or contextual risk factors. So primary risk factors are really about the presence or indicators that tell us that abuse is either imminent or already happening. And so those indicators are usually a disclosure of abuse occurring by an individual, or a disclosure that there have been threats. And threats are things like intimidation, stalking, so really clear verbal indications or even physical indications that are quite threatening towards violence is about to occur. Secondary risk factors, we're going to talk about them in two different ways. One are sort of focused on the abuser, and the other one are more focused on the victim. So in terms of the abuser, secondary risk factors have to do with some components of his life or their life that increase their risk. So things like having mental health issues, facing unemployment, recent or pending separation, or other significant life changes. So you can see how these risk factors are much more about what's happening in the life of the individual, and they're kind of like stressors that could increase that chance of engaging in abusive behavior. The other one I want to talk about are victim-focused risk factors. So those are about the individual who is potentially going to experience abuse and presents some vulnerability towards that. So these include language barriers, unemployment, lack of education, health issues, precarious housing, disability, immigration status, and a history of childhood trauma or childhood abuse. Now, when we think about there being primary risk factors, so abuse is either already occurring or imminent, and secondary or contextual risk factors that could sort of present some vulnerability and some pressure and stressors towards resulting in risk, I think it's important for us to talk about, we are talking about the full spectrum of the violence and abuse that can occur when we're thinking about these risk factors. So violence and abuse encapsulates emotional abuse, physical, sexual, financial, spiritual, verbal. And when we think about risk factors, while often we go to a place of physical in terms of having the most heightened risk, we need to recognize that verbal risk factors are also really, really important to understanding whether primary risk is present. So threats and intimidation and stalking are often really done through a verbal means. And when we are talking about primary risk factors, we are talking about our most heightened sense that something needs to be done to support this individual. So we need to sort of get out of our minds that thought that physical is at the apex of what is risky, and really thinking about that full spectrum of abuse and violence and how they intersect with those primary and secondary risk factors. Now, in terms of risk factors, I'm going to focus now on domestic homicide specifically. And the reason being that 1 in 5 homicides in Canada are within the context of an intimate partner relationship. So it's a definite possibility, it occurs, and it's something we need to take note of. But really importantly, we actually have some really good data that tells us there are clear indicators, clear risk factors that are present prior to the homicide, and that is based on lots of data through the Chief Coroner's Office of Ontario. So in fact, since 2002, they've been reviewing all cases of domestic homicide, and they found there are 39 risk factors, and that in 75% of cases, there were more than 7 risk factors present prior to the homicide. The most common risk factors are a history of domestic violence, recent or pending separation, obsessive behavior. So that can be things like trying to control, trying to really make sure that person has no contact, trying to separate them from others, trying to control what that person does even within the home. An abuser who is depressed, an abuser who is unemployed, a victim who is isolated. That can be particularly challenging in the context of a pandemic when a lot of us are isolated on some level. But what isolation might look like in this way would be things like not allowing the individual to leave the home, not even for a walk, not even for an essential medical appointment. Monitoring any texting or calling that the individual does to friends, family, or supports, so that really they're isolating them even within that home alone. An escalation of violence, threats to kill themselves or to kill the victim, and that the victim had an intuitive sense of fear. We're going to pause for a second and think about that one. So the most common way that an individual will talk about their relationship within the context of abuse or violence is usually in a way of sort of rationalizing it. So let's say they will name an outburst. They will name it as an outburst, that moment of violence, and they will link it to actions that they took as the victim, X and Y, that led to the outburst. So what they will rationalize is saying, if I don't do X and Y, that outburst won't happen. So there's a sense of control gained by doing that. When an individual starts expressing fear to you, that's a really important moment to take note, because it's actually the abnormal way of talking about the issue. That means that for them, they no longer have that sense that they can control. There's no longer an ability to rationalize the situation. And that fear is a really good indicator and an intuitive sense that we need to pay attention to. So in terms of domestic homicides, there's clear, most common 7 indicators, and some of those we're going to really link to some prompting questions next on how to get the information around primary, secondary, or homicide-based risk factors, and how we can then assess that information. We've talked about what are risk factors, primary and secondary. We've talked about more specifically domestic homicide and some of those really key risk factors within that, the top 7. Now we're going to turn to a bit of a decision framework around those risk factors and some sense of how do you gain the knowledge and that information about those risk factors. What are some prompting questions? So in terms of decision making, if there are no secondary or primary risk factors present, you want to just make sure that you continue to have that open dialogue space for that individual in case they do arise, but there's no action needed. Conversely, if there are primary risk factors present, action is needed in the now. And so that really looks like consultation with someone who is an expert in doing that risk assessment, collaboration with the individual, and clear referrals or clear walking through that engagement. Primary risk factors are not to be taken lightly. They are not a wait and see approach. They are highly mobilizing action in the immediate. Now, when we're talking about secondary risk factors, I think that's important to realize that there's a heightened stress and heightened vulnerability on the relationship. And we want to really make sure that we are an open conduit for information could start to be given to us if some forms of abuse and violence start to be present, because there is such heightened stress and vulnerability on that relationship. So really making sure that that relationality is open and that sense of trust is present. You can also realize that while there are primary risk factors, there also could be disclosures of all forms of violence that are not quite meeting the threshold of that primary risk factor. So forms of gaslighting, forms of emotional manipulation. These are things that are violent and abusive, but they don't quite meet the threshold where that sense of immediate, imminent danger is present for primary risk factors. And so you want to be there and you want to be present for that individual. You want to make sure that they have supports through that process and that they have a conduit to disclose if something becomes more onto the threshold of the primary risk factors. Now, how do you gain the knowledge of these risk factors? So some prompting questions that might get you into that conversation are, we're going to start really broad and then we're going to narrow in. So really broadly speaking, how have you been lately? How have things been going for you? You know, in the context of this pandemic, for a lot of us, there's so much more stress involved and there's so much more fear. How is your partner handling that? And how are you handling that? What's going on in your home? In terms of all of the government advice and the health professionals' advice and isolation, and how's your partner managing that? How are you managing that? Are you and your partner both still working? Are you working from home? Or one of you in an essential service? How's that going for you? So you can see they're quite broad. They're not specific to violence or abuse, but they're allowing you to gain some information about some of the stressors or some of the secondary risk factors we had talked about. So employment status, how is the mental health within the home? How is that relationship going? Depending on what arises in that conversation, there are some clear prompts that you can then go into. So something like, you know, I noticed that you said that your partner was really starting to kind of monitor who you were texting. And it was actually really hard for you to call me and make sure that it was private. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? What's that like right now? You might want to name, so as I just did, what was disclosed in terms of the action that is abusive or violent by reflecting the language to the person and ask them to open up about that. You might want to also go down the path of, you know, you had mentioned that your partner is not allowing you to go out for walks at all right now. When did that start for you? And has it gotten worse lately? Is it happening more often lately than it was before? So by asking a sense of what was before and is it worse now, you're getting a sense of whether that escalation is present, and you're allowing sort of more disclosure into that space to identify whether there are potential primary risk factors present. Are you worried about your children's well-being? Are you worried about your own well-being? Have you sought help from someone about this before? That's assessing what kind of support system is in place and what kind of assessment has potentially been done already. I want you to know that there's help available. You've told me a lot today, and I'm wondering, can I share some of this with some professionals so that we can make sure that we can problem solve this together? Wanting to make sure that that individual feels supported and that they recognize that there is help and that you're going to help them navigate getting that help, that they are not on their own in this process, is a really big way of managing this. And then frankly, if primary risk factors are disclosed, you become quite clear in what you say, and you say, I'm afraid for your safety. I'm afraid for the safety of your children. Would you be willing to speak to a specialist about a comprehensive risk assessment? So you're gaining their consent, you're gaining a really clear sense that you are afraid, so you're putting that out there and that something needs to be done. So we talked about what are risk factors, broadly speaking. We've talked about sort of a decision framework around how to go about managing what is disclosed to you. And we've talked about some prompting questions to gain the information, to gain the potential disclosure of what is occurring in the home. So now we're going to turn to how to handle a disclosure of violence or abuse. So we're talking about the full spectrum of violence abuse here. So someone disclosing to you emotional or spiritual abuse, someone disclosing verbal, whatever that might be. But I think it probably is important to recognize at this point that if someone's disclosed to you primary risk factors in terms of violence, that would require a bit of a different decision framework and a different action than what we're going to talk about right now, and that we've covered that in the sense of needing immediate consultation, collaboration, and engagement with that individual. So I'm going to talk about some do's and some don'ts. They're pretty high level. They're to kind of guide us more in a general way, and then we can talk through more specifics based on the case you're dealing with if you reach out for some support on our helpline. So some do's. Make sure that you do tell them that they have options and that there's help, and that you will be that person who makes sure they can get to the next step in that help. They've clearly entrusted parts of their story to you. You've created that open pathway for them, that sense of trust. And so make sure that you honor that by bringing sort of another option, another sense of help to where they can be. So that might be our crisis and support line. And in fact, that's a pretty good one to give because it's 24/7. And you are not 24/7 in all the healthy boundaries of the professions that we all have. We need to make sure that we are not 24/7, but our staff are there for that individual whenever they need. So making sure they have that line is probably really important. But you might want to become familiar with what other options are available for the individual in terms of counseling, in terms of whatever that could entail. Having those at your fingertips so that you know that you can convey that there is help and you'll help them get to that next step for them. Stay in contact with them. They may quite likely not be ready to take any step upon the first few conversations, and that's okay. But if you sort of check in, you monitor what's happening, you also will be able to identify if there is an escalation, if there is all of a sudden a presentation of more primary risk factors, and you'll be ready for when they might want to take some help seeking and have those resources available. Do name what you're hearing and seeing. So when they're disclosing to you different parts of what their story is, naming that you're hearing that their partner is controlling, naming that you're hearing that they feel uncomfortable and potentially fearful, naming and reflecting some of the language that they're utilizing is important. It honors what they're saying, it validates what they're saying, it makes them feel heard in that. Ask if they would like you to engage in some safety planning. Now, I think it's important to just pause for a second and realize that safety planning is a really particular skill set. And for many of you, that might be within your wheelhouse, and for many, it will not. So if it is not in your wheelhouse, don't offer to do it. But we on our crisis and support line would be able to support you in conveying some of that information to the individual, or we would be there directly for that individual if they're open to having that kind of conversation. So safety planning is a way in which we engage in sort of mitigating some of the risk factors within the home so that the individual can have a certain sense of decreasing the violence, recognizing that the violence is never their fault, but what factors can that individual control or put in place to mitigate some of it. So in terms of the do's, do tell them that there are supports and help available and you'll help them get to some of those. Do stay in contact with them and regularly. Honor that open trust that they've engaged with you and connect with them. Name what you're seeing and hearing. And do offer to engage in some amount of safety planning or make sure that they're connected in order to do so. Now some don'ts. Don't demonize the abuser. You could hear some pretty awful things, and while you're going to name the behaviors and name what you're seeing, don't put value-laden judgment on the abuser who's engaging in it or even on some of the actions. When you engage in value-laden judgments, what you'll probably prompt in the individual is significant defensiveness. They love their partner, and while they hate the actions of their partner, potentially, or maybe they even think they deserve those actions of their partner, they will defend that partner and they will shut down on you and you will have lost that open conduit of information. So don't demonize the abuser. Don't encourage them to leave without a really clear safety plan. You might remember back to some of the risk factors of domestic homicide, one of which was pending or recent separation. The moment of leaving a relationship is usually the most dangerous within that relationship, and we don't engage in it lightly. We want to make sure that that individual is wrapped with supports, that they have a very clear safety plan in place. And so when we're thinking about if someone's ready to maybe take that step of leaving a relationship, we want to make sure that they've spoken with a professional and an expert on doing risk assessment and safety planning. And we're here on the crisis and support line to do that type of work. But do not push them towards leaving. And if they are thinking about it, make sure that they are connected and supported in that. Connected to not pushing them to leave is don't push them towards actions more broadly that they aren't ready to take. Usually that takes a lot of time before an individual is ready to take actions in regards to their relationship and their home life. And so recognizing that and recognizing that if they've disclosed information to you, they've already taken actions. They've already taken that step of bringing someone else into the loop. And so honor that, remain open to that, reflect that language, but don't push them towards actions. So in terms of don'ts, don't demonize, don't push them to leave, and don't push them towards actions they're not ready. So today we've talked about domestic violence and domestic homicide risk factors and risk assessment more broadly. We went into what are primary risk factors and secondary risk factors. We then spoke more specifically about domestic homicide and the specific risk factors in that. We went into a bit of a decision framework around how to manage when you are disclosed some of those risk factors. And we talked a bit about how to prompt some of that disclosure. So some open-ended questions, some more targeted questions to get the information to make that risk assessment. Finally, we moved to a bit of a handling of disclosures broadly, talking about some do's and some don'ts. I think it's really important at this point to recognize that this information today, incredibly important, but was only the tip of the iceberg. It was an introduction into the topic. And I'm hoping that some of it was helpful for you, and some of it will also have prompted a sense of, okay, I need to know a little bit more about that. And we're here to support you in getting the rest of the information that you might need that might be relevant to specific circumstances you're dealing with or specific practices within your profession. So please reach out and continue to do the learning that you can around violence and abuse. Thank you.